Hey YouTubers, welcome back to the Piper's Mantel. Since my first fantasy novel is going to be published in the second half of this year, provided there are no delays, I just wanted to talk about the book that started it all, the book that made me want to be a writer. Interestingly, this book didn't just impact me, it also greatly impacted C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia. The book I'm referring to is, of course, Phantastes, a Faerie Romance by George MacDonald. Now, a lot of people haven't even heard of George MacDonald, but he's considered by many to be the father of modern fantasy and the master of fairy. Phantastes was the first fantasy novel of the modern era, out of which everything else sprung forth. In fact, here are some quotes from a few of the authors he inspired. C.S. Lewis said, "I know hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continually close to the Spirit of Christ himself, hence his Christ-like union of tenderness and severity. Nowhere else outside the New Testament have I found terror and comfort so intertwined. I have never concealed the fact that I regarded him as my master. Indeed, I fancy I have never written a book in which I did not quote from him." J.R.R. Tolkien referred to MacDonald's fairy tales as stories of power and beauty. In fact, Tolkien never tried to hide the fact that the goblin tunnels from The Hobbit were lifted right out of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. And regarding The Princess and the Goblin, 𝐏𝐢𝐻𝐸, known as G.K. Chesterton, who wrote The Everlasting Man, had this to say: "But in a certain rather special sense, I for one can really testify to a book that has made a difference to my whole existence, which helped me to see things in a certain way from the start. A vision of things which even so real a revolution as a change of religious allegiance has substantially only crowned and confirmed. Of all the stories I ever read, it remains the most real, the most realistic, in the exact sense of the phrase, the most like life. It is called The Princess and the Goblin and is by George MacDonald." Lastly, Madeleine L'Engle had this to say: "Surely George MacDonald is the grandfather of us all of us who struggle to come to terms with truth through fantasy." The fantasy genre evokes a sense of longing for something greater than ourselves. There's something about it that forces us to take a break from ourselves so we can then learn about ourselves. Why did God allow us to have such vivid imaginations? Could it be that imagination reflects heavenly truth, like C.S. Lewis believed? Could it be that truth through fantasy fills us with hope for something we can't fully understand in our fallen conditions? The works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien have always remained close to my heart. But 6 years ago, when I stumbled upon an amazing author I'd never heard of, an author that both Tolkien and Lewis were admirers of, it literally changed my life. His name, of course, was George MacDonald, and he was born on December 10th, 1824 in the town of Huntly, Scotland. Unfortunately, George MacDonald was born during the Industrial Revolution, which was a time of change and new ideas. While the world was entering a new era, MacDonald was immersed in fiction, and one of his uncles was a notable Celtic scholar, having a library full of Celtic myths, fairy tales and poetry. In 1845, MacDonald graduated from the University of Aberdeen with a master's degree in chemistry and physics. Now, at this point he could have pursued a career in the medical field, but it's been speculated that lack of money put a stop to his ambitions. Nevertheless, having grown up in the Congregational Church, he began training at the Highbury College for the Congregational Ministry. And in 1850 he was appointed minister of Trinity Congregational Church in Arundel, a town of West Sussex, England. Sadly, there was a strong atmosphere of Calvinism in the Congregational Church, which MacDonald greatly rejected. Calvinists hold the belief that some people are predestined to go to heaven, while others are predestined to go to hell. But when George MacDonald first heard this notion, he actually wept. And I mean he literally wept, because he firmly believed that everyone was capable of receiving redemption. Ultimately, his teachings were met with ill favour, and because of this, his salary was cut in half. Eventually, he would resign from his position at Trinity Church and would engage in ministerial work. But throughout his life, MacDonald had consistently suffered from asthma, bronchitis, and even a bout of tuberculosis. With poor lungs, he was forced to move across the country in search of better air quality. In 1858, George MacDonald's first novel, Phantastes, a Faerie Romance, was published in London, England. It's a truly remarkable piece of work full of romance, adventure, and the breaking down of ideals. Even though it was the Harry Potter of its day, the older notions of romance and chivalry were all but dead. The world was no longer interested in fairy stories. Science and invention were the new god. The course of the world had been altered. Its trajectory could not be stopped. In fact, it wasn't until after the First World War that people began to search for something more meaningful. Both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were lucky enough to prosper throughout this limited revival. But, unfortunately, George MacDonald would never receive the praise he was due. In fact, Christian author Oswald Chambers wrote in his book Christian Disciples that it is a striking indication of the trend and shallowness of the modern reading public that George MacDonald's books have been so neglected. Picking up a copy of Phantastes one day at a train station bookstall, I began to read. A few hours later, said C.S. Lewis, I knew that I had crossed a great frontier. I completely agree with Lewis. I've read Phantastes several times and I've no doubt that I'll read it many times more throughout my life. No other work of fiction has broken down my ideals of beauty, masculinity, chivalry, heroism, good and evil, and the notion of self-sacrifice like Phantastes. It's a book that every man should read to break down his own ideals, and it's also a book that every woman should read if she wishes to know the secret to a man's heart and what he truly desires. Exploring the human condition through fantasy or truth through fantasy was something that George MacDonald did best. Today he is often regarded as the father of modern fantasy. There may be no Middle-earth or Narnia without the foundation laid by him, and for those who came after him, George MacDonald is the grandfather of them all. Now this will only be a short review as I don't want to spoil the entire story. I'm hoping you'll get a copy and read it for yourself. In the description of this video I'll include 2 links where you can purchase a copy of Phantastes, and 1 link where you can actually read it online for free, as most of George MacDonald's works are now in the public domain. Okay, the story centres around a young man called 𝐏𝐢𝐻𝐸, and the Greek translation of that name means pathless or ascent. The day after his 21st birthday he discovers a small fairy lady inside the desk of his late father. She shows him a vision of fairyland, and when 𝐏𝐻𝐸 awakes the next morning, that's where he finds himself. MacDonald's descriptions of fairyland are very vivid and full of life, with each flower having its own fairy. Convincing the reader to see beauty in the mundane is one of MacDonald's greatest gifts, and is consistently apparent throughout most of his works of fiction. 𝐏𝐻𝐸, like many young men, has a mind of ideals. Through many temptations and dangers, he navigates fairyland with the mind of a young man in his prime, looking to prove himself as a man and find his ideal of feminine beauty. But beauty can be deceiving, and this ideal almost costs 𝐏𝐻𝐸 his life. His inability to see past the illusion of beauty is just one of many ideals yet to be broken. When 𝐏𝐻𝐸 reaches the fairy palace, he spends quite a bit of time in the library and reads a story about a young man named Cosmo who sacrifices his life to free the soul of a beautiful maiden. This, of course, has a twofold meaning. Christ willingly sacrificed himself to save the souls of those who would accept him. The second meaning, of course, is to break down the reader's notion of self-preservation. None of us can beat the clock, and there is no greater love than to give up one's life to save another. This notion of self-sacrifice or dying to self is ultimately 𝐏𝐻𝐸's destiny in fairyland. After many trials and encounters with strange creatures, 𝐏𝐻𝐸 meets Sir Percival for the second time, who represents the ideal knight. Sir Percival is 𝐏𝐻𝐸's ideal of masculinity. In fact, the image contained in the illustrated version represents this perfectly, as Sir Percival is depicted as a heroic knight who has just slain a mighty dragon, which he is dragging alongside his horse. Few images in history have conveyed such a powerful depiction of masculine strength. Despite having already been knighted by the king, Anados flinches when faced with the real deal. Therefore, he becomes the knight's squire, hoping to embody him. But when they arrive at a gathering of idol worshippers, Anados's true value is finally revealed. You see, beneath the golden statue is a dark hollow where the priests are placing young children. But what the people at this gathering don't realise is that a giant wolf is hiding beneath the statue and is devouring the innocents. This is clearly a biblical reference to the practice of human sacrifice, and much to Anados's dismay, not even Sir Percival, the ideal knight, can perceive what is actually taking place. Therefore, Anados has no choice but to sacrifice himself to stop this act of evil, and, by toppling over the statue, the giant wolf comes bounding out. Fortunately, Anados is lucky enough to kill the beast before the priests finally slay him. Anados may not have been the masculine warrior he wanted to be, but, like Christ, he gave up his life to save many, and there is no greater deed than that. Despite having died in fairyland, Anados awakes to find himself in the human world once again. In the last chapter of the book there is a poignant thought which I encourage you to take note of. I began the duties of my new position, somewhat instructed, I hoped, by the adventures that had befallen me in fairyland. Could I translate the experience of my travels there into common life? This was the question. Conclusion. If, like many people, you're struggling with your own ideals, then Phantastes is the perfect book to break them. Not only will you have your illusions of self and worldliness destroyed, but you'll also be getting a great story filled with adventure, action and romance. Phantastes will encourage the reader to find his or her own worth, which may be apparent to others but not themselves. Everyone is unique and everyone has value, which is the greatest lesson you'll learn by reading this book. Phantastes is like no other book I've read, and George MacDonald's writing has a way of entering the soul, exposing it to new realities and endless possibilities. To conclude this video, I would like to leave you with another C.S. Lewis quote, followed by two of my favourite George MacDonald quotes. That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer. I had not the faintest notion what I had let myself in for by buying Phantastes. Every one of us is something that the other is not, and therefore knows something. It may be without knowing that he knows it, which no one else knows, and it is everyone's business, as one of the kingdom of light and inheritor in it all, to give his portion to the rest. The imagination of man is made in the image of the imagination of God. Everything of man must have been of God first, and it will help much towards our understanding of the imagination and its functions in man if we first succeed in regarding aright the imagination of God, in which the imagination of man lives and moves and has its own being.